A quiet night stirring. Samuel Long paced along the damp, darkened sidewalks of Brookside, his footsteps steady but unhurried. The glow of street lamps illuminated the slight mist curling along the pavement, and a light drizzle had begun to settle over the town. It was one of those late nights where the quiet was almost peaceful, wrapping around him like a blanket, but the slight hum of the city's underbelly still lingered in the distance. Brookside was his neighborhood, and though it was far from glamorous, it was home. Samuel, a 79-year-old retired military officer, was a man of disciplined habits, and a midnight walk to the ATM wasn't out of the ordinary for him. Despite his age, Samuel moved with a soldier's precision and a quiet strength that turned a few heads, even if he preferred to go unnoticed. As he approached the lone ATM beneath the washed-out glow of a lamppost, he took a moment to observe his surroundings. A remnant of his service days, he was always alert to the details others would miss. Across the street, a young man with a hood up was leaning against the side of a closed storefront. The boy's posture was restless, shifting from one foot to the other, his head dipped as though lost in thought, or perhaps just waiting. Samuel noticed the slight clench of his jaw as he moved his gaze back to the ATM and continued with his transaction, though a tinge of caution lingered in the back of his mind. As Samuel punched in his PIN, he felt the weight of a presence behind him. He could see the shadow stretching along the ground in the reflection of the ATM screen, a flicker of movement that put his senses on high alert. Without making any sudden movements, Samuel finished his transaction, retrieving his money and slipping it into his wallet. Then, with calm purpose, he turned around to face the young man who had approached. The boy couldn't have been more than 20, with a thin build and tense shoulders, his hand tucked inside his jacket pocket. When he met Samuel's gaze, he wore a faint, wavering smirk that didn't reach his eyes. His voice, thinly veiled with fox confidence, carried a hint of something that Samuel recognized from years of service, fear mixed with desperation. "Hey, old man, let's make this easy, all right," the boy said, his voice just barely masking the edge of a tremor. Samuel regarded him with a level expression, his eyes calm but assessing. "Evening," he replied, his voice steady as he took in every detail, the quiver in the boy's jaw, the slight shift of his weight as he tried to muster up the courage for whatever he intended to do next. The tension was palpable, hanging thickly between them. "Now, what exactly is it you want?" The boy scoffed, though his eyes darted anxiously to the side. "Don't play dumb with me, all right? Just hand over the wallet, and we'll both be on our way." Samuel's fingers relaxed slightly, though he kept his gaze unwavering. "Son," he said quietly, "take a moment and really think this through. Is this what you want?" The boy's smirk faltered, and for a brief second, Samuel thought he saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But the boy quickly swallowed it, tightening his grip on whatever was hidden in his pocket. "You don't know me," the boy shot back, his voice harder this time. "And you don't know what I'm capable of. So don't test me." Samuel sighed inwardly, recognizing the mixture of bravado and fear before him. He had seen it countless times. Young men who believed they had no other options, no other means to face their hardships. The streets had hardened them, leaving little room for softer virtues like trust or faith. He knew that desperation could twist anyone into doing things they never would have thought possible. And now, standing before him, was a young man at a crossroads, his life dangling in the balance of a choice he wasn't ready to make. "I may not know you," Samuel replied softly, "but I can see you're not as sure about this as you want me to believe." He took a slow, calculated step forward. "Son, I've lived a long time. I've been in places you can't imagine, done things that still haunt my dreams. You don't want to walk down this road." His voice carried the quiet weight of conviction, each word carefully chosen, measured, to reach the boy on some level he couldn't ignore. For a moment, the boy seemed to waver. Samuel could almost feel the internal struggle brewing beneath his hardened exterior. But the moment passed quickly, and the boy straightened, his eyes darkening as he pulled a small knife from his pocket, the blade catching the dim glow of the lamplight. "Don't act like you know me, old man," the boy hissed. "You don't know a thing about what I've been through." Samuel's heart clenched, not with fear, but with a deep sadness. He didn't flinch, didn't back away. Instead, he met the boy's eyes with an unshakable calm, his stance steady and unthreatening. "I may not know your story, but I've seen men like you," Samuel said. "And I know one thing. If you walk away from this moment, if you choose differently now, you'll thank yourself for it later. This isn't your only option, son." His voice softened, but it held a firmness that cut through the quiet night. "You're stronger than this. I can see it. Don't let fear or anger push you into a life you don't want." The boy blinked, his bravado cracking just slightly. For the first time, he seemed to truly see Samuel, not just as some old man with money to take, but as someone who had seen his own share of darkness. The boy's grip on the knife slackened, and Samuel could almost feel the scales tipping, the tension reaching a breaking point. But before he could say more, a sharp voice pierced the stillness of the night. "What's going on here?" Samuel and the boy turned as a third figure stepped into the light. The newcomer was broad-shouldered, towering, his face set in a fierce scowl as he strode toward them with an air of authority. Samuel instantly recognized him as trouble. This was someone who wielded intimidation like a weapon, and the moment his eyes locked on the boy, they blazed with anger. "Jake," he snapped, his voice low and threatening. "I leave you alone for 5 minutes, and you're here wasting time." The boy, Jake as Samuel now knew, looked down, his grip tightening around the knife once again as he avoided the newcomer's glare. The atmosphere thickened, and Samuel could see that any opportunity he had to reach Jake was slipping away. The older man exhaled slowly, weighing his next move, knowing that this confrontation was quickly escalating into something he might not be able to control. The shadows close in. Samuel held his ground as the tension mounted, studying the newcomer. The man exuded an aura of raw aggression and dominance. Every line in his expression, every movement of his bulk, broadcasted a warning Samuel couldn't ignore. He was taller and far younger than Samuel, likely in his 30s, with hands that looked used to hard labor, and even harder fights. He seemed to hold a cold ownership over Jake, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the young man's faltering courage. "Jake," the man said with a steely bite to his voice, "is there a reason this old man's still standing?" Jake shifted, his face pulling tight with apprehension. He held the knife in his hand but seemed reluctant to act now that Samuel had spoken to him. That moment of hesitation, of vulnerability, hadn't gone unnoticed, and Samuel could see the frustration tightening in the larger man's scowl. The newcomer sneered, then shot a dark look Samuel's way. "I don't know who you think you are, Grandpa, but you need to mind your business. Jake and I have work to do, and you're in the way." "Work?" Samuel's voice was calm, his gaze steady as he continued to observe the two men. "Is this what you call work? Shaking down people in the middle of the night? If that's the case, you're teaching the boy the wrong kind of lessons." The man's face twisted in anger, and he took a step closer to Samuel, muscles flexing beneath his worn leather jacket. "I don't need a lecture from you," he growled. "Now I'm giving you one last chance. Walk away before I make you." Samuel raised his hands, showing he had no intention of escalating things, but his expression remained unmoved, his resolve clear. "If there's one thing I've learned, son," he said softly, "it's that fear and anger have a way of leading a man into traps he can't climb out of." He turned his gaze to Jake, who looked trapped between obedience to the older man and the voice of reason Samuel had managed to reach in him just minutes before. "You don't have to keep doing this, Jake," Samuel continued, his voice low and certain. "This man, he's a dead end. I can see that you're not beyond reaching, but you have to choose that for yourself." The larger man, whom Samuel had started to think of as Eddie, snapped. He stepped forward, grabbed Jake by the collar, and hissed something into his ear that made Jake wince, his body going rigid with tension. "You want to keep talking, old man," Eddie taunted, his eyes daring Samuel to say another word. "Fine, but once you're out of our way, Jake here will remember who's got his back." He shoved Jake forward, jerking his head toward Samuel. For a heartbeat, everything was still, the weight of the moment almost suffocating in its tension. Jake stood frozen, knife in hand, torn between obedience to Eddie and the unexpected hope Samuel had planted in him. He looked like a boy standing on the edge of a cliff, terrified to jump, and yet equally afraid to remain where he was. "Jake," Samuel's voice cut through the silence, sharp and clear. "There's still a choice here, even if it doesn't feel like it." But before Jake could react, Eddie grabbed the knife from his hand and lunged forward, his face twisted with anger. Samuel sidestepped, instincts from his years in the service kicking in as he dodged Eddie's wild swing. The larger man stumbled, and in that brief window, Samuel saw an opportunity. He swept Eddie's legs out from under him with a swift kick, sending him crashing to the ground, the knife skittering across the pavement. Eddie scrambled up, fury blazing in his eyes, but Samuel remained calm, assessing, every movement controlled. "Is this really the path you want to drag him down?" Samuel asked, his voice stern. "You think violence will keep him loyal? I've seen men break under that pressure, and you're heading down that same road." Eddie laughed, though there was a tremor of uncertainty in it. "You don't know a thing about us, old man. Jake and we've been through hell together. And if he's going to survive out here, he needs to learn how to handle himself. So step aside before this gets ugly." But Jake didn't move. Instead, he stood off to the side, eyes locked on Samuel, the knife forgotten. For the first time, Samuel saw the full weight of fear in his expression, a glimpse into the years of manipulation and control he had endured under Eddie's influence. Samuel's heart ached for the boy, who was on the verge of breaking free, yet still shackled by the fear Eddie had instilled in him. The older man took a deep breath and held Eddie's gaze with a quiet authority that went beyond words. "Jake isn't going to find what he needs under your thumb, Eddie. Maybe you think you're helping him, but there's more to life than just surviving. And if you push him any harder, you're going to find that out the hard way." Eddie sneered, but Samuel's words seemed to reach Jake. The young man took a tentative step forward, the conflict in his eyes giving way to a resolve Samuel hadn't seen before. I don't want this anymore, Eddie," Jake said, his voice breaking. "I've been following you because I thought you had answers, but maybe there's more for me than just this." Eddie's face twisted in anger, and he lunged toward Jake, fists clenched, but Samuel was ready. With a swift, practiced movement, he blocked Eddie's advance, stepping in between the two men with a confidence that left no room for doubt. Eddie halted, fury and disbelief warring in his expression, as he stared down the quiet but unyielding wall that Samuel had become. "You're making a mistake," Eddie spat, but the defiance in his voice had dimmed. "You don't know the first thing about him, or about me." Samuel shook his head slowly. "You're right. I don't know everything. But I know one thing. Pushing people through fear doesn't build loyalty. It breaks them." Jake, emboldened by Samuel's presence, took a deeper breath and straightened his shoulders. "He's right, Eddie. I've been too afraid to see it before, but I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Eddie looked ready to fight, his fists clenched tight, his jaw set. But slowly his gaze shifted from Samuel to Jake, and he seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own anger and desperation. "You'll regret this, Jake," he muttered, voice low, though his bravado had dimmed. "When you're out there on your own, you'll wish you had someone watching your back. Don't come crying to me when you realize you made a mistake." Jake's face softened, a flash of sadness in his eyes as he looked at the man who had been his mentor, his so-called protector. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I need to figure out who I am without someone else calling the shots." Samuel placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, a quiet reassurance that gave the boy strength. Eddie watched them, his gaze cold, before he turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet street. He cast one last bitter glance over his shoulder before disappearing into the night, leaving Samuel and Jake standing alone under the streetlight's glow. Jake let out a shaky breath, and for the first time, Samuel saw the hint of a smile on his face, a tentative, uncertain thing, but a start. "Thank you," Jake whispered, his voice hoarse with relief. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't. Well, if you hadn't been here tonight." Samuel nodded, giving his shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze. "You did the hard part, son. It's not easy to walk away from something you've known for so long. But you did it. Now you've got to figure out where you want to go from here." The words struck a chord with Jake, who nodded slowly, the weight of his newfound freedom settling on him. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice small. "All I've ever known is what you just saw. I don't have a family. I don't have any real skills. I don't even know who I am outside of all this." Samuel's face softened, his eyes full of understanding. "That's the thing about starting fresh. You don't need to know everything right now. You just need to know what you don't want. And from there, you can figure out what you do want." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, the quiet of the night settling over them like a blanket. It was as if the city itself had taken a breath, acknowledging the gravity of what had just happened. Samuel felt a deep satisfaction, not just for helping Jake, but for knowing he had given him a lifeline, a second chance to rewrite his story. "Look," Samuel continued, his voice gentle but firm. "There's a community center just a few blocks from here. They've got people who can help you figure things out, get you on your feet. They run classes, help with job training, and there are even counselors who've been through their own struggles. It's a place where you won't be judged, just given a fair shot." Jake's eyes lit up, though the fear hadn't entirely left them. Do you really think they'd take me in? After everything I've done?" Samuel nodded with a reassuring smile. "I know they will. But it's up to you to go, to take that first step. It won't be easy. You'll have to face things about yourself, things you've been running from. But if you're willing to do the work, there's a way forward, and it's yours for the taking." Jake looked down, the gravity of Samuel's words settling over him like a weight. He nodded slowly, as if finally making up his mind. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll give it a try." Samuel gave his shoulder one last pat before releasing it. "Good. And remember, you're not alone. No one gets through life without help. And if you ever feel lost again, you come find me. We're in this together." With a final nod, Jake turned and walked away, his steps hesitant but purposeful, heading in the direction Samuel had pointed him. Samuel watched until Jake had disappeared into the distance, a quiet sense of accomplishment warming him as the rain began to drizzle down harder, soaking into the pavement. As he turned to head home, Samuel couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. Retirement didn't mean he had to stop helping others, especially those who were struggling. In his heart, he knew that Jake's journey was just beginning, and though he had guided him to the path, it was now up to Jake to walk it. And Samuel, in his own quiet way, resolved to keep watching over him, like a shadow in the night, ready to lend a hand whenever it was needed. The path forward. Jake's footsteps echoed on the rain-soaked sidewalk, each step pulling him further from Eddie's shadow and deeper into an uncertain but promising future. He barely noticed the rain trickling down his face, his mind whirling with Samuel's words. It felt strange, liberating yet terrifying. To walk alone, to know he had made a decision for himself, one that wasn't Eddie's or anyone else's. The quiet confidence in Samuel's voice had stuck with him, like an anchor tethering him to the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could carve out a life of his own. The rain was falling harder now, misting over the street lamps and giving the night an eerie, dreamlike quality. Jake pulled his hood up as he walked toward the community center Samuel had mentioned, clutching his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. His thoughts drifted back to his younger years, to the time before Eddie had taken him under his wing, back when he was still naive enough to believe in possibilities. He could barely remember the last time he had felt anything close to hope or purpose, but Samuel's quiet conviction had stirred something in him. Maybe, he thought, there was a life for him beyond the streets, beyond the violence, beyond the emptiness he had grown so used to. As he rounded the corner, he spotted the community center. It was a modest building with a simple sign that read, Brookside Community Outreach. A soft, warm light spilled out from the windows, casting a welcoming glow onto the wet pavement. Jake hesitated, his mind filling with doubts. What if they turned him away? What if they saw through him, saw the years of mistakes, the things he'd done? He could almost hear Eddie's mocking voice in his head, warning him that he would never be more than a thug, that people like him didn't get second chances. But he could still feel the weight of Samuel's hand on his shoulder, the steadiness in his gaze as he'd spoken. You don't have to know everything right now. You just need to know what you don't want. With a deep breath, Jake stepped forward and opened the door, the warmth of the room hitting him like a wave as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the community center was bustling with activity. A few people were gathered near a small table, pouring steaming cups of coffee, while others sat in groups, talking or reading. Posters adorned the walls, with information on everything from job fairs and GED classes to addiction support groups and housing assistance. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the tense, quiet nights Jake had grown accustomed to. He felt out of place, standing just inside the door, unsure of where to go or who to talk to. But before he could turn around and leave, a woman approached him, her smile warm and open. "Hi there," she said, holding out her hand. "I'm Claire. I haven't seen you around here before. Are you new?" Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah, I'm just looking for. I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm looking for, really." Claire's smile didn't waver. "You're in the right place. Most of us here didn't know what we were looking for when we first walked through those doors, either." She motioned to a row of chairs near the wall. "Why don't you sit down, and I'll grab us some coffee. We can talk, see if there's anything we can help you with." Jake nodded again, grateful for her kindness, and made his way to one of the chairs. As he sat, he glanced around, feeling both out of place and oddly comforted by the sense of belonging that seemed to permeate the room. He watched as Claire returned with 2 cups of coffee, her movements calm and unhurried. She handed him a cup, then settled into the chair beside him, her gaze warm and steady. "So," she said, taking a sip from her cup, "what brings you here tonight?" Jake hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about Claire's calm presence made him feel safe, as if he could trust her. "I met someone tonight," he began, his voice rough. "An older guy. His name's Samuel. He helped me see that maybe I don't have to live the way I've been living. That maybe there's more out there for me." Claire's face softened, and she nodded in understanding. "Samuel's a good man. He's helped a lot of people around here, given them hope when they thought they had none." Jake looked down, the shame and regret he had been trying to suppress bubbling to the surface. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I deserve a second chance." Claire reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "We all have things we're not proud of, Jake, but that doesn't mean we're beyond redemption. The fact that you're here, that you're willing to change, that's what matters. No one's going to judge you for your past. We're all just trying to move forward, one step at a time." Her words struck a chord in him, and for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a faint but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way out of the darkness he had been living in. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, before Claire spoke again. "We've got a few programs here that might interest you," she said. "There's a GED prep class, some job training programs, and a few support groups if you're interested. You don't have to decide right now, but if you want to stick around, you'll find there's a lot of people here who've been where you are." Jake nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I don't know where to start, but I want to try." Claire smiled, her eyes bright with encouragement. "That's all you need to do, one step at a time." Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself returning to the community center almost every day. The unfamiliar environment had become a place of refuge, a sanctuary where he could escape the shadows of his past and begin to rebuild. He started attending the GED prep classes, sitting in the back at first, too self-conscious to raise his hand or participate. But as the weeks passed, he found himself becoming more comfortable, more willing to try. The staff at the center, including Claire, were patient and supportive, never pushing him beyond what he was ready for, but always encouraging him to take the next step. The people he met there became an unexpected source of strength. They were people from all walks of life, some older, some younger, but all carrying their own stories of struggle and redemption. There was Martin, a middle-aged man who had struggled with addiction for years before finding the support he needed at the center. There was Lisa, a young mother who had escaped an abusive relationship and was now working towards a degree. Each person he met had their own battles, their own scars, but they were all fighting to build a better life, and their determination inspired him. One afternoon, as he was studying for a math test, he felt a familiar presence behind him. Turning, he saw Samuel standing in the doorway, a quiet smile on his face. "Samuel," Jake said, surprise and warmth evident in his voice. "I didn't think I'd see you here." Samuel chuckled, walking over to take the seat beside him. "I like to check in on things every now and then, make sure everyone's doing all right." Jake smiled, a rare but genuine expression that lit up his face. "I'm doing better. This place, it's given me a reason to keep going, to keep trying." Samuel nodded, his gaze filled with pride. "I knew you had it in you, Jake. Sometimes, all we need is someone to believe in us, to help us see what we're capable of. But remember, the credit belongs to you. You chose to be here. You chose to put in the work. That takes courage." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Samuel's words, but for the quiet, unwavering support he had shown him. "I don't know if I would have made it here without you. That night, you could have walked away. You didn't have to help me." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Jake, I've been in dark places myself. I've seen what happens when people don't get the help they need. If I can do something to prevent that, to help someone find their way, then that's enough for me. It's why I do what I do." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Samuel's words settling over Jake. He realized then that Samuel's quiet strength came not just from his past, but from his desire to make a difference, to help others find their way even when the world seemed dark. As the weeks turned into months, Jake continued to make progress, each small victory building his confidence. He passed his GED exam, a milestone that filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. He started looking into job training programs, considering careers he had never imagined possible. And through it all, Samuel was there, a steady presence, a mentor, and a friend who never let him lose sight of the path he was on. One afternoon, as they were leaving the center together, Jake turned to Samuel, a question that had been on his mind finally finding its way to his lips. "Samuel," he began, his voice hesitant, "why did you help me that night? I was just some kid with a knife. You could have walked away, called the cops, anything. Why did you give me a chance?" Samuel paused, his gaze soft but thoughtful. "I saw myself in you, Jake," he said quietly. "There was a time when I was lost too, when I didn't know if I'd make it out. But someone reached out to me, gave me a chance, just like I gave you one. I've made it my mission to pay that kindness forward. And I saw something in you that night, a spark, a will to be more than what the world had made you. I couldn't turn my back on that." Jake nodded, the weight of Samuel's words settling over him. He realized then that Samuel's kindness, his belief in second chances, wasn't just about him. It was part of something bigger, a mission Samuel had dedicated his life to, a legacy of compassion and resilience that he was now a part of. As they walked together under the fading light of the evening, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the second chance he had been given, but for the man who had shown him the way. He knew his journey was far from over, that there would be challenges and setbacks along the way. But with Samuel's guidance and the support of the community, he felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, to build a life he could be proud of. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Jake felt, for the first time, a sense of hope, an unbreakable belief that he could change his path, that he could rewrite his story. Trials on the path. The days at the community center turned into weeks, and each step forward felt like a victory for Jake, a small but significant departure from his old life. Every morning, he arrived early to join the GED study sessions, his notebooks and textbooks growing dog-eared and filled with notes. In the afternoons, he attended job training workshops, where he was learning about carpentry and repair work, skills he had never considered valuable before, but now saw as a path to steady work and self-respect. Yet, despite his progress, Jake still felt the shadow of his past lingering at the edges of his new life. It was easy to fall into doubt on the quiet nights when he was alone, easy to hear Eddie's mocking voice in his mind, reminding him of his mistakes. The specter of failure haunted him, and with every forward step he took, he feared that one wrong turn could undo everything. Samuel sensed this. The older man seemed to have an uncanny ability to read Jake, to know when his doubts and fears were creeping up on him. He didn't push Jake to talk, didn't lecture him. Instead, he offered quiet support, small reminders that he was not alone. Their conversations were often brief but profound, with Samuel planting seeds of encouragement and wisdom that would take root in Jake's mind, helping him build the strength he needed to continue. One late afternoon, after a particularly exhausting day, Jake was packing up his things when he saw Samuel waiting by the door, a thoughtful look on his face. "Hey, Jake," Samuel said, his voice calm but carrying a note of concern. "How about we take a walk?" Jake nodded, grateful for the offer. He had been feeling the weight of his doubts that day, and Samuel's quiet presence had a way of steadying him. They stepped out into the cool evening air, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the street. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, neither of them in a hurry, letting the quiet deepen their connection. Finally, Samuel spoke, his voice thoughtful. "I can see you've been working hard, Jake. You've come a long way in a short time." Jake nodded, but his expression was conflicted. "I have," he admitted, "but I still feel like it's not enough. Like no matter what I do, my past is always there, reminding me of all the wrong choices I made." Samuel stopped walking, turning to look at Jake with a piercing gaze. "The past doesn't define you, Jake. It's a part of you, yes, but it doesn't have to be the whole of who you are. Moving forward means learning to forgive yourself, even for the things you can't change." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard, Samuel. I've hurt people. I've done things I can't undo, things that still haunt me. I'm scared that one day all of this," he gestured to the community center, "won't be enough to keep me from going back to that life." Samuel's expression softened, and he placed a steady hand on Jake's shoulder. "I know it's hard. Forgiving yourself is one of the hardest things to do, but you don't have to do it all at once. Every day you make a choice, every step you take towards something better, you're rewriting your story. It's not about erasing the past, Jake. It's about building a future strong enough to stand beside it." Jake looked away, blinking back the emotions that threatened to surface. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, to letting anyone see his scars. But with Samuel, it felt safe, as though his pain and regrets were met with understanding instead of judgment. They continued walking, their steps in sync, until they reached the edge of the park, where a small pond reflected the fading sunlight. The quietness of the place, the stillness of the water, gave Jake a moment of peace, a break from the noise in his mind. As they stood by the water's edge, Samuel spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, I want you to know something. Every one of us has regrets, things we wish we could take back. But life isn't about those moments. It's about what you do with the ones that come after. You have a choice every day to live in a way that honors the lessons you've learned, to be the kind of person you're proud to be. That's all anyone can ask." Jake nodded, the weight of Samuel's words settling over him. He felt a spark of hope, a tiny flame that gave him the strength to keep going, to believe that maybe he could be more than his past mistakes. The next few weeks saw Jake immersing himself even deeper in the programs at the center. He was making real strides in his carpentry training, and with the encouragement of his instructors, he began working on small projects around the community center, fixing broken chairs, repairing tables, and even helping with minor renovations gave him a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt in years. Each project was a reminder of his potential, a symbol of the person he was striving to become. But change rarely comes without tests, and one evening, as he was heading home after a long day at the center, Jake found himself facing one of his greatest challenges yet. As he turned onto his street, he heard a voice call out from the shadows, a voice he hadn't expected to hear again. "Jake, long time, no see." He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, as Eddie stepped out from a nearby alley, his figure partially obscured in the dim streetlight. The familiar sneer on Eddie's face, the hard set of his jaw, brought back memories Jake had been trying to leave behind. A part of him wanted to turn and walk away, but he knew Eddie would follow, would make a scene, would drag him back into the darkness he had worked so hard to escape. "Eddie," Jake said, his voice steady but wary, "what are you doing here?" Eddie chuckled, his gaze cold as he looked Jake up and down. "Just checking in on an old friend. Haven't seen you around much. Thought maybe you've forgotten about us, about who you really are." Jake swallowed, feeling a wave of anger and fear rise in him. "I haven't forgotten, Eddie. But I'm not the same person I was back then. I'm trying to do something different, something better." Eddie's face twisted into a sneer. "Better? You think you're too good for us now? Too good for the people who had your back when no one else did?" Jake took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm grateful for the times you helped me, Eddie. But that life, it wasn't what I wanted. It's not who I want to be anymore." Eddie took a step closer, his face contorted with disdain. "You think those people at the community center are going to save you? You think they care about someone like you? They're just waiting for you to slip up, to prove you're still the same loser you've always been." Jake's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm, to remember the things Samuel had taught him. "Maybe I'll make mistakes, Eddie, but at least I'm trying to change. That's more than I can say for you." The words came out before he could stop them, and he instantly regretted it. Eddie's face darkened, and in one swift movement, he lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the collar. "You think you're better than me," Eddie hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You're nothing, Jake. You're just a kid playing pretend, and the second things get tough, you'll come crawling back to me." Jake met Eddie's gaze, refusing to back down. He could feel his heart racing, but a new strength rose within him, a quiet resolve born from months of hard work, of second chances, of believing he could be more. "I won't be crawling back, Eddie. I'm done with that life." For a moment, Eddie's grip tightened, his face twisted with anger. But then he released Jake, pushing him back with a sneer. "Fine," he spat. "Run off to your little community center. Play at being someone you're not. But don't come looking for me when you realize it's all a lie." With one last look of disgust, Eddie turned and stalked back into the shadows, leaving Jake standing alone in the street, his body trembling with adrenaline. But as he watched Eddie disappear into the night, Jake felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as if a weight he had been carrying for years had finally lifted. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. He knew now, with absolute certainty, that he was done with that life. Eddie's words, his anger, his disdain, they no longer had power over him. That night, Jake returned to his small apartment, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He felt a mix of fear and triumph, a strange exhilaration at having faced Eddie and come out on the other side unscathed. He had stood his ground, had refused to be pulled back into the darkness, and it felt like a victory, a hard-won step forward on the path he was forging for himself. The next morning, he arrived at the community center early, feeling a new sense of purpose, a renewed commitment to the life he was building. As he walked through the doors, he saw Samuel waiting for him, a knowing look in his eyes. "Rough night?" Samuel asked, his voice calm but filled with understanding. Jake nodded, feeling a wave of gratitude for the older man's quiet support. "Eddie showed up," he said, his voice steady. "He tried to drag me back, to make me feel like I couldn't be more than I was." Samuel nodded, his gaze filled with pride. "And what did you tell him?" Jake looked away, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I told him I was done, that I wasn't going back." A slow, proud smile spread across Samuel's face. "Good. Standing up to the past isn't easy, Jake. But you did it, and every time you make that choice, every time you stand your ground, you're building the life you deserve." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, a sense of accomplishment he could barely put into words. For the first time, he felt like he was truly in control of his future, that he had the strength to carve out a path that was his alone. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey they had shared settling over them. Jake knew he still had a long way to go, that there would be challenges and setbacks along the way. But with Samuel by his side, with the support of the community that had become his family, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And as he turned back to the work ahead, he felt a quiet but unbreakable conviction that he would keep moving forward, one step at a time. The shadows of his past might still linger, but they no longer held him captive. He was free, and he was ready to write the next chapter of his life. A chapter filled with hope, resilience, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The burden of redemption. Jake's new life began to take shape in ways he hadn't dared to hope for. At the community center, he was slowly becoming known not just as a regular, but as someone who could be relied upon. He arrived early every morning, helping the staff set up for the day, making sure the place was tidy, and often staying late to assist with repairs and other tasks. His skills in carpentry had grown sharper, and the staff began to trust him with more significant projects, like fixing up storage spaces, repairing broken benches, and even repainting some of the walls. The physical work gave him a sense of peace, grounding him in the tangible results of his efforts. Yet as the days stretched into weeks, Jake found himself haunted by questions he couldn't easily shake off. He had left behind his old life, yet the scars of those years followed him like shadows. Though he had faced Eddie and taken a stand for his future, he still wrestled with guilt for the people he had hurt and the bridges he had burned along the way. It was as though his past lay in wait, watching his every move, ready to remind him that redemption was no easy thing to earn. One Thursday evening, after a long day of fixing chairs and repainting the center's small office, Jake found himself alone in the quiet of the community center. The staff had left, the lights dimmed, and he stood in the stillness, looking at his reflection in the window. He barely recognized the man looking back at him, a man with calloused hands, a leaner face, and a gaze that seemed older, more resilient. Yet even as he admired his progress, a sense of weariness settled over him, as if he was carrying a weight he didn't know how to shed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The memories of his past life seeped into his dreams, blurring the lines between what was real and what he feared might still be part of him. He dreamt of old friends he'd let down, of nights spent with Eddie, where loyalty was measured in shared crimes rather than support. He woke up in the dark, drenched in sweat, his mind swirling with the ghosts of mistakes he couldn't undo. The next day, he walked into the community center with bags under his eyes, exhaustion etched across his face. He went through his usual tasks, but his heart wasn't in it. For the first time in months, the doubts that had once controlled him felt close, ready to take hold if he faltered. It was in this state that Samuel found him. "Jake," Samuel greeted, his voice gentle but firm as he approached him by the supply closet. "You look like you haven't slept in days. What's weighing on you?" Jake hesitated, unsure of how to express the turmoil inside him. But Samuel's steady gaze, his quiet understanding, made it easier to let the words come. It's the past, Samuel," Jake admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. "I keep thinking about the things I've done, the people I hurt. No matter what I do here, no matter how hard I work, it feels like it'll never be enough to make up for it." Samuel nodded, a sympathetic look in his eyes. "The past has a way of sticking with us, Jake, but that doesn't mean you're bound by it. Redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing who you want to be, every single day, in spite of it." Jake shook his head, frustration edging into his voice. "But what if I can't ever make it right? What if no matter what I do, I'm still the person who did all those things?" Samuel placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his expression one of calm conviction. "We can't change what's behind us, Jake, but we can do our best to make things right where we are. Maybe it'll never be enough to erase the past, but every good choice, every act of kindness, every moment of growth, that's part of your redemption. You have to give yourself permission to be more than your mistakes." The words resonated with Jake, yet they didn't entirely lift the weight he carried. He wanted so badly to believe that he could be free of his past, yet a part of him feared it would always be there, lurking, waiting to remind him of the person he once was. That weekend, Jake was invited to a community outreach event, organized by the center, to help clean up a nearby park and repaint some of the old picnic tables and playground equipment. He joined the team of volunteers, rolling up his sleeves and working beside them, grateful for the distraction. The work was physical, demanding, and gave him a sense of purpose, a chance to feel useful in a way that was pure and untainted by his past. As he was painting a rusted swing set, he noticed a young boy watching him from a distance, his eyes wide with curiosity. Jake offered the boy a smile and motioned for him to come over. "Want to help?" Jake asked, holding out a paintbrush. The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly, taking the brush with both hands. They painted in silence for a while, the boy dipping his brush in the paint, carefully applying it to the swing set with a focus that made Jake smile. After a few minutes, the boy looked up at him, curiosity shining in his eyes. "Did you paint things before?" the boy asked, his question simple but genuine. Jake hesitated, surprised by the question. "Not like this," he admitted, "but I'm learning." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his painting. Jake watched him, feeling a strange sense of peace as they worked together. It was as though the innocence of the moment, the simplicity of sharing a task, had temporarily lifted the weight on his heart. For a few precious moments, he felt free, as though he truly was the person he was trying to become. But the quiet peace was short-lived. As they finished up, Jake heard a voice he hadn't expected, a voice he hadn't heard in months. "Well, well, look who's gone all good Samaritan on us." Jake's heart sank as he turned to see two men he recognized from his old life, Mitch and Carlos, both of whom had been friends of Eddie. They stood at the edge of the park, watching him with expressions that were equal parts amusement and disdain. He felt a wave of panic rise in him, a sudden, paralyzing fear that his new life was crumbling before his eyes. Carlos laughed, his voice laced with mockery. "Didn't think we'd find you here, playing house with the community folks. Looks like the prodigal son's gone soft." Jake's fists clenched, his face a mask of tension as he forced himself to stay calm. He didn't want to react, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled, but a part of him, the part that had grown up surviving on the streets, felt the urge to lash out, to defend himself in the only way he knew how. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low but controlled. Mitch shrugged, his face twisted into a sneer. "Eddie's been talking about you, saying you've turned into some kind of saint. We wanted to see it for ourselves." Guess he was right. Jake's jaw tightened, his thoughts racing. He had worked so hard to build a new life, to prove to himself that he was more than the mistakes he had made. But here they were, the people he had tried to leave behind, threatening to pull him back into the darkness. "I'm done with that life," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you're here for, it's not going to work. I'm not the same person anymore." Carlos smirked, crossing his arms. "Maybe not, but you're still one of us. You can play the hero all you want, but deep down, you'll always be the same Jake we knew." Jake felt the words like a blow, a reminder of the life he had left behind, but couldn't fully escape. He opened his mouth to respond, to tell them to leave, but before he could say anything, Samuel appeared beside him, his gaze calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the tension. Mitch and Carlos exchanged a glance, their bravado wavering under Samuel's steady gaze. For a moment, they looked ready to respond, to escalate the confrontation. But something in Samuel's expression, in the quiet power he radiated, seemed to make them think twice. "Nothing we can't handle," Mitch muttered, his voice losing its edge. He glanced at Jake one last time, a sneer on his face. "We'll be seeing you around, Jake." They turned and walked away, their mocking laughter echoing through the park as they disappeared into the distance. Jake watched them go, his heart pounding, a mixture of relief and anger simmering inside him. Once they were out of sight, Samuel turned to him, his expression calm but understanding. "They're part of your past, Jake, but you're not bound to them anymore. You have the power to choose who you want to be, regardless of what they think." Jake nodded, feeling the truth in Samuel's words, though it didn't entirely erase the bitterness he felt. "It's hard, Samuel. Sometimes it feels like no matter how far I go, my past is always there, waiting to pull me back." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, his gaze filled with pride. "Redemption isn't a destination, Jake. It's a journey. There will always be reminders of where you came from. And sometimes the road will feel steep, impossible even. But every choice you make, every step forward, is a victory. And you're not alone on this path." Jake took a deep breath, letting Samuel's words settle over him. The encounter with Mitch and Carlos had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. He was stronger now, grounded in the life he was building, and for the first time, he felt a quiet certainty that he wouldn't go back. As they walked back toward the community center, the weight of his doubts felt lighter. He knew there would be more challenges, more tests of his resolve. But with Samuel's support and the foundation he had built at the community center, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the city, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that he was not defined by the mistakes he had made, but by the choices he continued to make. His journey was far from over, but he was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with the strength and resilience he had found within himself. And as he looked over at Samuel, a man who had given him hope when he had none, he felt a deep gratitude, a quiet determination to honor the second chance he had been given. For Jake, the path forward was clear, and he was ready to face it, with courage, resilience, and the unwavering belief that he could be more than his past. Embracing tomorrow. The weeks passed, turning into months, and with each day, Jake's sense of purpose grew. He was no longer just another visitor at the community center. He was part of it. He had become someone others could rely on, someone people respected and even turned to for guidance. The once nervous newcomer had become a familiar face, a trusted presence whose quiet determination was a source of inspiration for many of the people around him. One chilly autumn morning, Jake arrived early at the center, just as he had every day since he'd first walked through its doors. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves, and he felt a calm resolve as he unlocked the doors and stepped inside. This place, which had once felt foreign and intimidating, had become a sanctuary, a place where he felt he belonged. But he knew he was nearing the edge of something bigger, something that would eventually take him beyond the walls of the community center. As he went about his morning routine, Samuel entered, offering Jake a knowing nod. Samuel, as always, had a calm, grounded energy about him, and over time he had become more than a mentor. He was a friend, a guide, and someone who had been unwavering in his support of Jake's transformation. "Jake," Samuel said, his voice calm yet carrying a hint of purpose, "how about we grab a cup of coffee? I've got something I want to talk to you about." Curiosity piqued, Jake agreed, and together they walked to a small coffee shop down the street. They took a corner booth, the warmth of the cafe a welcome relief from the chill outside. Samuel ordered his usual black coffee, while Jake went for something with a bit of cream, a new preference he picked up as he spent more mornings working alongside the center's early risers. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each nursing their coffee, until Samuel finally spoke. "You've come a long way, Jake," he said, his gaze steady. "I've seen you grow, not just in the work you do, but in who you are. You've faced down your past, put in the effort, and created a life you can be proud of. That's no small thing." Jake looked down at his cup, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I never thought I'd get here. Some days, it still doesn't feel real. Like I'm waiting for someone to remind me that I don't belong here." Samuel leaned forward, his expression earnest. "But you do, Jake. You've built this life for yourself, and no one can take that away from you. The question now is, what's next?" Jake paused, taken aback by the question. He hadn't thought beyond the walls of the community center, beyond the small world he had constructed as a safe haven. For him, each day had been about proving that he could walk the straight and narrow, that he could be someone who didn't have to look over his shoulder. The future had always been something distant, too far off to consider. "Next," Jake echoed, a mixture of excitement and apprehension in his voice. "I guess I hadn't really thought about it." Samuel smiled, a spark of pride in his eyes. "You've got potential, Jake. You're not just a man who's survived his past. You're a leader, someone who understands struggle and resilience. You could take what you've learned and use it to help others, to make an even greater impact." The weight of Samuel's words settled over Jake, and he felt both honored and uncertain. He had become comfortable at the center, finding solace in the routine, in the security of the place that had saved him. But the idea of stepping out of that comfort zone, of reaching others beyond the familiar faces of Brookside, stirred something within him, a longing for a purpose that was bigger than himself. "Are you saying you think I should work here? Help run the place?" Jake asked, his voice filled with cautious hope. Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. "Not exactly. I think your path might lead you to something even broader than that. You've experienced the difference a place like this can make, and there are countless others who need the same kind of support. I'm talking about expanding, starting new centers, reaching out to communities that need a guiding hand." The enormity of what Samuel was suggesting left Jake momentarily speechless. He had never considered himself someone capable of leading, much less someone who could bring about change on such a scale. But as he looked into Samuel's eyes, he saw genuine belief, a belief that he hadn't encountered often in his life. It was more than trust. It was a deep conviction that he was ready for more, that he had it in him to build something transformative. "I don't know, Samuel," Jake said slowly, his voice tinged with doubt. What if I'm not enough? I'm still just a guy who's trying to make it day by day. I've still got so much to figure out." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder, his expression calm but unyielding. "Jake, None of us ever have everything figured out. What matters is that you're willing to try, that you're open to growth. That's all leadership is, a willingness to keep learning, to keep pushing forward, even when the road is uncertain. The conversation stayed with Jake long after he left the coffee shop. As the days passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was right, that he was being called to something greater. The work at the center, while fulfilling, was no longer enough to contain his ambitions. He wanted to reach more people, to offer others the same second chance he had been given. In the weeks that followed, Jake threw himself into learning more about community outreach, studying everything he could about nonprofit work, social services, and even counseling. The more he learned, the more he realized how vast the need was, how many people lived in the same dark places he had once inhabited, desperate for a hand to pull them out. With Samuel's guidance, he began laying the groundwork for a plan, one that involved opening a network of centers across the city, each one designed to be a beacon of hope for people who had been overlooked and forgotten. But as he moved forward with this vision, Jake faced one of his greatest challenges yet. The more he delved into the logistics and practicalities of his dream, the more his self-doubt resurfaced. He began to question his abilities, wondering if he truly had the strength and resilience to carry out such a monumental task. The shadows of his past crept back, whispering reminders of his former self, of the mistakes and failures that still haunted him. It was during one of these low moments that he received an unexpected message. It was from Lisa, a young woman who had recently started attending the community center. Lisa had come to the center seeking refuge from an abusive relationship, and over the past few months, Jake had seen her grow and rebuild her confidence, much as he had. She had written a simple note. "Jake, thank you for being here. You showed me that I could believe in myself again, that I didn't have to stay where I was. You're an inspiration. Don't ever doubt that you're making a difference." The message struck Jake deeply, reminding him of why he had started this journey. It wasn't about his doubts, his fears, or even his past. It was about the people who needed someone to believe in them, who needed a place to turn when they had nowhere else to go. That night, he made a decision. He would move forward, not for himself, but for those who were still trapped in darkness, waiting for a light to guide them out. The day finally came when Jake held the opening ceremony for the first of the new centers, a modest building in a struggling neighborhood across town. It was a culmination of months of planning, hard work, and the unwavering support of Samuel, who stood by his side as they cut the ribbon together. The crowd that had gathered was modest, but filled with people from all walks of life. People who, like him, had been searching for a second chance. As he looked out at the crowd, a profound sense of fulfillment washed over him. For the first time, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, that his life had led him here not by accident but by purpose. And as he addressed the crowd, his voice steady with conviction, he felt the weight of his past finally lift, replaced by a newfound sense of clarity. "This center is here for anyone who needs it," Jake said, his voice strong and filled with emotion. "It's here for those who think they have no way out, for those who've been told they're not enough. I've been there myself, lost in the dark, but someone believed in me, and because of that, I'm standing here today. This is a place for second chances, a place to rebuild, to heal, and to find hope again." The crowd responded with quiet applause, and as Jake looked around, he saw familiar faces, people from the Brookside Center, volunteers who had helped him along the way, and even Lisa, who gave him an encouraging smile. They were all part of his journey, each one a reminder of the power of resilience, of the strength found in community. After the ceremony, Samuel pulled Jake aside, his face filled with pride. "Jake, I hope you know how far you've come. What you've built here, this is just the beginning. You're giving people hope, showing them that change is possible. Don't ever underestimate the impact you're making." Jake felt a surge of gratitude, a deep, humbling acknowledgement of the journey he had taken. He had started as a man weighed down by regret and guilt, but he had emerged as someone who believed in the power of redemption, not just for himself but for others. The centers he was building weren't just about him. They were about creating a legacy of compassion, of second chances that would ripple through the lives of everyone who walked through those doors. As the evening wound down, and the last of the attendees left, Jake stood alone in the quiet of the new center. He looked around at the empty chairs, the freshly painted walls, and he felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The journey that had once seemed impossible, the life he had once thought unreachable, was now his reality. He thought of Eddie, of the life he had left behind, and he felt a profound sense of peace. He had made peace with his past, not by erasing it but by transforming it, using it as fuel to create something meaningful. The shadows no longer held power over him. They were simply a part of the road he had traveled, a reminder of the strength he had found within himself. As he turned off the lights and locked up for the night, Jake knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more centers to open, more people to help, and more lives to touch. But he was ready, more than he had ever been. He was no longer the man he had once been. He was someone who had risen from the darkness, someone who had found his way not just to redemption but to purpose. And as he walked down the quiet street, the stars shining above him, Jake felt a deep, abiding sense of hope. He was part of something bigger now, something that would continue long after he was gone. His life was a testament to the power of change, of resilience, and of the simple, unbreakable truth that it is never too late to choose a different path. For Jake, the future was no longer a question or a fear. It was a promise he intended to keep, one step at a time, for as long as he could.